the NHL trade winds are beginning to stir, creating a flurry of speculation around several prominent teams and their strategic maneuvers. At the forefront of these discussions are the Toronto Maple Leafs, actively engaged in monitoring the defense market, and the St. Louis Blues, facing significant questions regarding their forward lineup and potential trade decisions. Key players like defenseman Luke Schenn and Dougie Hamilton are drawing attention as potential targets for Toronto, while forwards Robert Thomas, Pavel Buchnevich, and Jordan Kyrou find themselves at the center of trade rumors involving the Blues. This intensified activity is unfolding as the NHL trade deadline approaches, a period often characterized by high-stakes transactions and roster adjustments, particularly with injuries impacting crucial team personnel across the league. The current landscape suggests both Toronto and St. Louis are at critical junctures, necessitating careful evaluation of their rosters and potential acquisitions or divestments in the trade market. Toronto's defensive depth has been significantly challenged by a series of injuries to key blue liners. The absence of players like Chris Tanev, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, and Brandon Carlo has created a pressing need for defensive reinforcement, escalating the urgency for the Maple Leafs to acquire additional depth on the back end. Simultaneously, in St. Louis, the offensive production of Robert Thomas has seen a noticeable decline, a trend that mirrors broader performance concerns within the Blues roster and has fueled extensive trade speculation. These two distinct situations underscore the dynamic and often unpredictable nature of the NHL trade market, where player performance, unexpected injuries, and strategic team objectives coalesce to shape critical decisions. Toronto's historical and ongoing interest in Luke Schenn, alongside past discussions regarding Dougie Hamilton, highlights a persistent and unaddressed need for defensive stability. Meanwhile, speculation abounds that the St. Louis Blues might opt for a significant roster retooling, potentially involving the trade of core players such as Thomas, Buchnevich, and Kyrou. The Maple Leafs' search for defensive solutions has led them to identify specific targets. Luke Schenn remains a player of continuous interest for Toronto, representing a familiar and potentially accessible option to bolster their defensive core. Dougie Hamilton has also been identified as a player with Toronto on his approved trade list, though the feasibility of such a transaction remains uncertain due to his contract and the significant salary cap implications. The growing list of injured defensemen, including Tanev, Ekman-Larsson, and Carlo, has only intensified Toronto's urgency, making a move to acquire blue line help increasingly imminent. On the St. Louis side, trade considerations revolve around several key forwards. Robert Thomas, despite currently being on injured reserve with a lower body injury and experiencing a slight reduction in production, remains a highly valuable asset, attracting considerable speculation. Beyond Thomas, Pavel Buchnevich and Jordan Kyrou are also frequently mentioned as potential trade pieces, should the Blues decide to embark on a more comprehensive roster retooling. To provide context for potential returns, trade comparables for number one centers offer valuable benchmarks. Tomas Hertl, for instance, was traded in the second year of an 8-year deal, yielding a first-round pick and a previous first-round prospect. Jack Eichel's trade involved a first-round pick, a second-round pick, Alex Tuch, and Peyton Krebs, with his neck surgery influencing his overall value. Bo Horvat, as a pending unrestricted free agent, commanded a first-round pick and a prospect, or additional pick. For top six centers, players like J.T. Miller, Elias Lindholm, Pierre-Luc Dubois, and Ryan O'Reilly also serve as relevant benchmarks for assessing potential trade values. The Blues' expectation for Thomas is reportedly a really good offer, one that would need to include at least a first-round pick and a high-end prospect to justify moving a player of his caliber. Given his current contract value and well-rounded two-way play, the Toronto Maple Leafs' defensive struggles have been exacerbated by a series of significant injuries, creating an urgent need for blue line reinforcements. Key defensemen such as Chris Tanev, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, and Brandon Carlo are currently sidelined, substantially depleting the team's depth and increasing the pressure on management to secure additional defensive assets. This precarious situation underscores the immediate challenge facing the Maple Leafs as they navigate a competitive NHL season. Concurrently, the St. Louis Blues are grappling with their own performance issues, most notably the downturn in offensive production from Robert Thomas. This individual dip reflects a more pervasive problem within the Blues roster, prompting widespread speculation regarding potential trades. The confluence of these factors highlights the dynamic nature of the trade market, where team needs, player performance, and strategic objectives constantly shift. Toronto's documented interest in Luke Schenn, alongside prior discussions involving Dougie Hamilton, signifies a persistent requirement for defensive stability that has yet to be fully addressed. Meanwhile, the St. Louis organization is reportedly considering a significant roster overhaul, with Thomas, Pavel Buchnevich, and Jordan Kyrou frequently cited as potential trade candidates. The prevailing market dynamics underscore the competitive environment in which both the Maple Leafs and the Blues operate. Toronto's predicament, driven by multiple defensive injuries, necessitates immediate action. The absence of players like Tanev, Ekman-Larsson, and Carlo has created a critical void that must be filled to maintain the team's competitive edge. This situation exemplifies how unforeseen circumstances, such as injuries, can drastically alter a team's strategic priorities. For the Blues, Thomas's reduced production, while concerning, is part of a larger narrative of underperformance that has led to internal evaluations and external speculation. The team's current trajectory suggests a potential retooling, where established players might be moved to acquire assets for future development. Both scenarios demonstrate the intricate relationship between player performance, team objectives, and the broader competitive landscape of the NHL trade market. Toronto's continued pursuit of Luke Schenn, a player with whom they have a history, suggests a preference for known quantities who can integrate quickly into the team's system. Similarly, the previous interest in Dougie Hamilton indicates a long-standing desire for a high-impact defenseman, even if the financial and contractual implications are substantial. The speculation surrounding the Blues' core players, particularly Thomas, Buchnevich, and Kyrou, indicates a willingness to consider significant changes. If the organization decides to break up its core, these players represent valuable trade assets that could fetch substantial returns. The decision to move such players would reflect a strategic realignment aimed at addressing the team's current performance challenges and building for the future. The competitive nature of the NHL trade market means that both teams must carefully assess their options, balancing immediate needs with long-term strategic goals. For the Maple Leafs, the immediate priority is to acquire defensive depth that can mitigate the impact of their current injury crisis. For the Blues, the focus is on maximizing the value of their assets to facilitate a successful retooling. These situations collectively illustrate the constant interplay between internal team dynamics and external market forces that shape critical decisions in professional sports. The pressure on both franchises to make judicious moves is immense, given the high stakes involved in player acquisitions and divestitures. The outcomes of these potential trades will significantly influence the competitive landscape for both the short and long term. The Toronto Maple Leafs' pursuit of defensive reinforcements continues, with Luke Schenn remaining a prominent target. Their sustained interest in Schenn suggests a preference for a player familiar with the organization and capable of integrating quickly. This familiarity could prove crucial given the urgent need to address their blue line deficiencies. Another name frequently associated with Toronto is Dougie Hamilton. Reports indicate that the Maple Leafs are on Hamilton's approved trade list, which, while offering a potential pathway, presents significant challenges. Hamilton's substantial contract and the Maple Leafs' existing cap constraints make any potential acquisition complex. The feasibility of such a high-profile trade, therefore, remains a considerable question mark, despite the clear interest. The current injury crisis, involving key defensemen such as Chris Tanev, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, and Brandon Carlo, has significantly escalated the urgency for Toronto to acquire additional defensive assets. This rash of injuries has transformed a long-standing need into an immediate imperative, forcing the Maple Leafs to actively explore all available options before the trade deadline. Concurrently, the St. Louis Blues are navigating their own set of trade considerations, particularly concerning their forward group. Robert Thomas, despite being on the injured reserve with a lower body injury and experiencing a slight dip in production, remains a valuable asset in the trade market. His two-way play and contractual value make him an attractive prospect for teams seeking a top-six center. Beyond Thomas, Pavel Buchnevich and Jordan Kyrou have also been identified as potential trade pieces, should the Blues commit to a more comprehensive roster retooling. The decision to move any of these core players would signal a significant strategic shift for the St. Louis franchise, aimed at rebuilding or rebalancing their roster. To contextualize the potential returns for a player of Thomas's caliber, several trade comparables for number one centers are often cited. Thomas Hertl, for instance, was traded in the second year of an 8-year contract, yielding a first-round pick and a previous first-round prospect in return. Jack Eichel's trade involved a more complex package, including a first-round pick, a second-round pick, Alex Tuch, and Peyton Krebs. His situation was unique due to a significant neck surgery, which influenced his market value. Bo Horvat, as a pending unrestricted free agent, commanded a first-round pick and an additional prospect or pick. These examples illustrate the high value placed on established top-tier centers in the NHL trade market. Further benchmarks for top 6 centers include J.T. Miller, Elias Lindholm, Pierre-Luc Dubois, and Ryan O'Reilly. The trades involving these players provide a spectrum of returns, influenced by contract status, age, and performance. For the Blues, the expectation for a potential Robert Thomas trade is substantial. Given his current contract and consistent two-way play, St. Louis would likely require a really good offer. This would entail at least a first-round draft pick and a high-end prospect to even consider moving a player of his foundational importance. The Blues management is reportedly not seeking to simply offload assets, but rather to maximize returns for any player they consider trading, ensuring that any transaction significantly benefits the team's future prospects. The implications of these potential moves for both the Maple Leafs and the Blues are considerable, shaping their competitive trajectories for seasons to come.